Welcome back. You're watching HFO-TV. HFO-TV is co-sponsored by J.R. Johnson LLC, specialists in multifamily restoration and repair work. Gantry Incorporated, the nation's largest independent mortgage banking firm.
Welcome back to HFO-TV. I'm Greg Frick, partner at HFO Investment Real Estate. Today we have Milissa Ormiston with Vice President of IPX1031. For most of the people out there in our audience, know the basis of 1031, so we're going to talk a little bit about some changes we've seen and some of the impacts of kind of what's going on. So Milissa, thanks for taking the time to speak to the audience. And I guess one quick question is, what are you seeing, in terms of trends in 1031 exchanges in this, it's kind of an odd time with what we've seen with transaction volume in the last, quarter and what we think it's going to go in the, the next couple of quarters. But, what trends are you seeing and what does, the year look ahead for you?
So, not surprising, we're definitely having lower numbers than we had, just like
Right.
If real estate numbers go down, so do exchanges. So, it's not really a huge surprise. The numbers we're probably seeing are really similar to what we did in 2019, which I think that's probably what a lot of people are seeing as well. Your office space sector is definitely slowing down. And again, that's really to be expected because we have so much, high vacancy rates in office space. Right. But I will tell you that we are seeing seeing our larger clients coming out and doing more transacting because they're cash deals. They're taking advantage of those higher interest rates and how they're impacting the buyers that have to get financing. So we are seeing some of those bigger players in the real estate market coming out and investing and transactioning, which is a good thing. They're taking advantage of those market value adjustments. The other note that we're seeing is some really unexpected positive impact is the unprecedented IRS extension for most of California. So what's really different about this one is that, like I said, it's impacting most of California, and they just did another revision. If you have sold on or after January 8th of this year, you have until October 16th to complete your exchange.
So if you sold after the 8th of January of this year, you have till the 16th of October. Wow, okay, whoa.
And there's no identification requirement.
And there's no identification period.
Right, because they're simultaneous.
Wow.
So you're basically just have to complete your exchange by then. So that could have a really positive impact for people that are potentially looking at moving their investments out of California.
So have you seen a pickup of people inquiring about, making plans to,
Yeah, my counterparts in California for sure have really seen it. I haven't yet really had people kind of adjust to that idea of how that might impact, but my colleagues in California are going crazy over this extension.
And so they have to be either a resident of California or their relinquished property has to be located in the state of California.
Correct. Now, it's not the entire state, but it's pretty darn close.
Okay.
So yeah, this is fairly new, and it really, honestly, there's some really, like I said, positive impact on how this could really help people move and not maybe be so worried about finding that replacement property, which tends to be a big hesitation for people.
And the reasoning for the extension is the environmental issues,
It's all the storms that we've had. So they had one initially that came out that gave them till May. That came out in December. And then they came out with a second one that pushed it out to the October 16th date.
And have other states done this before?
This has never happened before.
Really?
Yeah, when I say unprecedented, that's truly what I mean.
And because the state's doing it, does that mean the feds follow right in behind that, or how does that work?
It's not the state, it's the feds.
It's the Fed. Got it. They just did California as the state for this.
Right. And there's some things going on in Alabama as well, because there's been a lot of challenges.
There's always things going on in Alabama. There's always things in Alabama.
Exactly. This year in 22, I don't think we've ever seen so many extensions based on weather-related issues, right? So every year we have extensions based on this, but this one really, actually, I will tell you, Greg, it's almost reminiscent in my mind to the extensions that the IRS extended in 2020. Right. So if you have from April, right, because of COVID, right. So if I either had to identify by April 1st or my 180th day was by April 1st, I had till July 15th. They just made it a flat when the tax, remember they gave us an extension on
they
our
get extension on the taxes too, right?
Right. So depending on where people were at that point in their exchange, and that was nationwide, if my 45th day was April 1st or my 180th day was April 1st, I had till July 15th to complete my exchange or identify. And then, but the sad part is if you were March 31st, well, sorry.
Do you get word that this may be coming from the federal government that, hey, or is it just kind of, hey, here's the date and dropped in and you guys make adjustments?
A little bit of both, so obviously when there's a federal declared disaster area, there's always the potential that the IRS will grant extensions, but they get very specific. So when we had the fires a few years ago in Oregon, remember Detroit Lake just got destroyed, right? Actually, I drove through there the other day. It's pretty amazing with the rebuild, but, that was very specific to a part of Oregon. They'll do typically counties by county.
Gotcha.
Right.
By county.
So with the one for COVID, that was a national thing. And so it was pretty, so this is reminiscent of that. It's very impactful. There's a lot of, it's very broad.
And so if somebody who lives in California owns a property up here, do they qualify for that? So do both have to be within the state or one or the other?
Either they reside there or their business so their investments in California. It's either or. So if you have a California client, they reside in California, but their investments are even in Oregon, they still have that extension.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's we'll make sure we'll get that information out because that's, I think, it opens up like I said, and not having the identification period either. I mean, having that ability to say I've got until October to do what I need to do. So,
and I can share some information on that with you that you can share.
That'd be great. Yeah, we'll get that out for sure.
Everything, yeah.
So then I know, Biden released his budget for 2024, this week and, proposed a cap on deferred gain of like-kind exchanges. Do you see that going through or kind of we hear this every couple of years. It comes up every, we're going to have a cap on 1031's or they're going to go away. I mean, is the industry, are you guys, fearful
We're
of this?
We're not
or
overly concerned at this juncture, just due to the political climate. Now, when he initially, so first of all, let's be real, Greg. Whenever we have a change in the White House, it almost always comes up. A 1031 exchange really looks like low-lying fruit. It looks like a way to get more revenue. So even I know it seems strange, but even Trump proposed it. He actually proposed full elimination of 1031 exchanges.
I remember that. Yes.
And with the tax code change in 2017, they actually eliminated personal property exchanges.
Right. So that was the big change in 17, which we deal with a little bit now in doing exchanges in the state of Washington with, sales tax on that stuff. And we've got to carve out now on personal. So that was kind of the big, yes.
Yeah. So I think hotels were probably a big area where that impacted because you could do all of your, items, that transferred with the hotel, right? There were companies that specifically did for car rentals. So when they would get rid of their fleet and get a new one, they would do exchanges. So things like that got impacted, but it's just one of those things that happen. So when Biden originally proposed it when he was running for office, and it was very concerning. There's a lot of impact, and it was even more aggressive than what Obama had proposed. It's a maximum of 500 per person, and it really would effectively eliminate commercial real estate and larger farm and ranch exchanges. And it really will be difficult to get past in a split government. So, by the way,
so you guys aren't as fearful this time as
No, we definitely want people to say things to their senators and congressmen for sure, that you don't like the idea. But the FEA, which is the Federation of Exchange Accommodators, is very active in DC. And so we're on top of it, and we're definitely not as concerned this time around as we were before. Because there's a lot of really serious economic impact from eliminating this. And they really try to present it as this terrible loophole for the ultra wealthy and this and that and the other thing. And honestly, you're really impacting middle America with this, and just the impact. Ernst & Young did a pretty extensive study last time that indicated that just by having exchanges, it increased jobs by almost 600,000, and $27.5 billion in labor income, with over $55 billion in value added to the U.S. economy. So there's just a tremendous impact. Greg, I'm sure you've been in this business a long time. Anytime the government does anything that impacts the real estate market to slow it down, it impacts our overall economy. It's not a good thing.
Oh, most definitely.
We're way too dependent on real estate for our overall economic health. We're not an exporter. We don't build a lot of things. And so real estate ends up being just a huge part of our entire, GMP. So you don't really, and fortunately this goes to the Ways and Means Committee. So they're pretty well aware of how this impacts. And when he got it through, when he brought it around, when he first came into office, when it got through both the House and the Senate, it was eliminated. It was pulled out. And then he got it. So okay, this is his third attempt.
Well, like I said, every time we get a new somebody in the White House, it always comes up there. And the fear, as I've talked to people before about it, is there's a sense that the industry is, from National Association of Realtors to our, on the multifamily side to commercial side, are all very much will get in front of this and fight it. It's just once it's on the wall, it always gets taken off, but they always throw it back on and it just comes back off. So it's. One thing I was going to ask about, I've get asked, because Multnomah County, our city, has this proposed capital gains, possibly in the city on sales or on everything. Would that qualify? Could that be rolled in, or is that going to be out of the exchange part, or how is that going to work?
Well, currently both Multnomah County and the city of Portland have a tax, and so they have a sales tax, right? So if you do an exchange, those are deferred just like your state income tax and the capital gains. So it'll depend on how they word it. But it should still be deferred if they're going to be smart about it.
We've talked about if they don't do it that way, then is it going to be looked at more like an excise tax, like a sales tax that Washington County has, but the rest of Oregon doesn't have. So if they're not going to allow it to be deferred, then is it more of an excise tax? And there's a that's against in Oregon you can't do that. So it'll be interesting to see how that gets through.
Right. Well, Washington State had put in for a capital gains tax, and they actually decided they were going to just approve it, and then they got sued because you can't implement a tax in the state without it going to the voters. And that had included that if someone did an exchange, they would defer the Washington capital gains tax. And the FEA actually kind of stepped in and helped them with the wording because it was a little confusing. So the FEA does really watch very closely on not just a federal level, but on state levels whenever they see anything that could impact real estate and exchanges. In fact, you and I have talked about that, Greg, when we were talking about some new proposals in Oregon, how that can impact the real estate market in the multifamily part and all of that. And speaking of multifamily, we do see an increase in that market in exchanges.
Oh, good.
So we have, So multifamily has definitely had an uptick as far as being a larger share in that market segment for exchanges, because when you have uncertainty in the market, we know that people need housing.
And do you see, are people exchanging, is that number going up of people exchanging into multifamily from other product types, or is it typically multifamily investors exchanging into other multifamily, or is it a combination?
I think it's a combination of, I've, it's just interesting to see where people are going. I will tell you from my previous employer, I haven't looked at it recently, but what was really an interesting statistic for me was, after the pandemic, we kind of all felt like everyone's fleeing the West Coast, right? And so I ran some numbers to get an idea. And typically on the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, and California, which is where most of my clients are going to be originating out of, most over 50% buy in the same state they've sold out of, right? They
do.
They stay. Mhm.
Interesting. Okay.
And now what was interesting was I wanted to get an idea, what was the variance after the pandemic? And I think it's really slowed down, but because this was like 21, but California saw a 5% drop. So 5% fewer selling out of California bought in California. Washington stayed pretty flat. Oregon saw a 15% change. So 15% fewer selling out of Oregon bought in Oregon as prior to the pandemic.
And we've seen that with a lot of our clients that are looking now, just because of some of the taxes, the regulations, the estate tax of, and I think COVID, I've said this before in many interviews, is I think COVID fast-tracked a lot of people's decisions. Am I gonna retire here, or do I want to end up here? And so because of that, as they maybe look at moving in, other states, or for whatever reason, then they look and say, well, geez, I've got one or two assets in Oregon. Do I make that plan to exchange that out of Oregon? I think we've seen a lot more of that.
Yeah, and it wasn't surprising to see, because I also looked at where were they buying and how different was that as far as pre-pandemic. And unsurprising, a lot were buying in red states.
Yeah.
But I don't even think it was because of the political aspect. I think that red states, typically, we see that being a little bit more landlord or business friendly.
And they've had a lot of growth. I mean, you're looking at, from Arizona, the Southeast, basically the Smile States, Idaho, because of our proximity to Idaho, I think we've had a lot of, immigration to Idaho. And, it's, again, if they're going to move to there and say, hey, we're, going to, plan or, get situated here. Do we want to have one asset in Oregon? Is it worth it for the tax reasons? Do we take advantage and do an exchange and move our equity over? We've got this generation that have owned real estate. We've both been in this business for a long time. And now they're starting to look at, getting it, how do they get it to their heirs, or, kind of the estate planning stuff. What advice do you give people on how to use, 1031s as a vehicle to maybe look at that, or some things that they could start doing, preparing for those discussions?
Estate planning is super critical. First of all, talking to an estate attorney and getting a trust set up is 100%. You got to do it. And I'm surprised at the number of people that don't have trust set up. I mean, I understand probate alone in California can take you 3 years. So you do not want to get tied up in a 3-year probate.
And we're just talking about a basic trust. You're not talking about a remainder trust, just to avoid probate.
And a revocable trust. I mean, at least having that. And 1031 exchanges are definitely a viable tool for estate planning. If you utilize that for, if they're getting to a point, they've got kids, they want to diversify into either more passive and type of investments requiring less management from them, because either the kids don't have any interest in taking over the management, or maybe they don't have kids directly, as their heirs. They don't have someone to do that with, or even splitting those investments up so that, they don't have to worry about the kids fighting later. I've got 2 brothers right now that are doing that right now. So they're a little bit older. They're holding a portfolio of some properties as a partnership interest, and they're staging it. So they're going to do their drop and have the seasoning, which is recommended. It doesn't happen a lot, but that's the recommended method. And then they're going to exchange separately into their own investment properties. So then it goes right to their kids. And as I said, the cousins then don't have to fight over it or anything like that, which is smart. They're planning ahead. Another area that people should really be looking at is using the RevProc 2008-16. That's where it is a two-step process. So maybe I sell, a property or two and I roll them into where I want to retire. Maybe that's Florida or Idaho, where I have some more favorable tax situations later too. And I have my retirement home. So with the RevProc 2018-16, that's saying I can exchange into a property to preserve that safe harbor intent. I want to rent it out for 2 years, and then I can move into it as my forever home. So that's another way that they can kind of exit out, at least with a portion. I mean, if they've got a good portfolio of real estate, they're not going to do it with all of it, but they could take
But as a portion, they could do that.
Yeah, peel a piece off and use that as my forever home. So, but definitely doing estate planning with an estate attorney, as well as looking at, what's my real estate portfolio, working with my broker, looking at exchanges as that tool to allow me to diversify into investments that are going to make it easier as I get to that point where I'm going to exit out and go live by the pool, I guess.
Arthur moving or whatever. Yeah, whatever the plan. Yeah, it's just, as we tell people, just you may not know what, but just at least get people on your team at least planning for it, or talking or asking the questions, because it's really hard to do, when you have to, or after the fact, so to speak. Taking those steps ahead of time makes it so much easier for everybody.
I had a gal in her 90s doing an exchange. I was like, I want to be you when I'm 90. I mean, her son was 75, and she's still I'm going to do this exchange. I'm like, awesome.
Well, we have the other option where we got the family where the parents think everything's fine, and they go on, and then everything hits the fan for kids or the cousins, and it's because it wasn't. They just assumed everybody would continue the way it was, and it's I hate to say it usually doesn't happen that way.
Well, I was actually happy with that particular case that both her son and her granddaughter were actively involved, because especially when you have an older person like that, you don't want anyone thinking you're somehow taking advantage of them.
Right.
So I was happy. She was a spitfire, though. I will give you that.
So then I know one thing that's come up is recently a lot of people using cost segregation on projects, either rehabs or newer construction. I mean, what concerns should people be aware of, when they're, looking at doing a cost segregation on a new purchase, or maybe, something they've owned, they're going to do a rehab? I mean, what are the things you want them to look at or think about from your perspective on, the 1031?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with the Tax Cut and Job Act of 2017, one of those things to kind of help stimulate the economy, especially I think with getting away from personal property exchanges, that probably was one of the reasons they kind of brought it in. For the purposes of depreciation, you're able to cost seg out some personal items, and they could do 100% depreciation. Now, this is the first year that it's dropped down to 80%. And it will decrease 20% a year through 26. So it'll be completely gone by 27. So it's just a temporary thing. Now it really is a big benefit. And so a lot more people are utilizing it. And let me give you just a little bit of an idea. So as far as the structure, so the real property is going to fall under what's the 1250. The personal items fall under the 1245, which again, is just for the purposes of depreciation, still part of the real property. Right. And traditionally that has been depreciated at 5, 7, 10, and 15 years, whereas commercial property is depreciated straight line at 39 years, and all residential, including multifamily, 27 and a half years. So if let's just say I've got a $1 million real estate property and my building is 750, the building of it, right? Because we only depreciate improvements,
just
real
property,
right? Right. The land doesn't depreciate, we only appreciate, right? So if I just took a 39-year straight line, that's a benefit of a little over $18,000. Okay. Now, typically the reclassification is going to be anywhere between 25 to 50% of that building cost. So if I took a 25% reclassification, that would increase my write-off to $52,000. Okay, so pretty significant. Well, so through last year, if I took that, and that kind of just did a breakdown between 15, 7 and 5 years, right? And I took a 25% of that to come up with the 52,000. Well, they would have been able to write off last year a little over $200,000. Okay, right. Which is a good, especially if someone's got a lot of taxable income. That's a great benefit. This year that'll drop down to about 165,000.
Because it's going to be 80% this year, and then next year will be, you drop by 20% each year. Got it.
So what we're seeing is more people are doing it than before, because that's a nice benefit, right? So I think it probably has encouraged people to buy into new real estate. Now, what they should really be aware of, if they're intending to exchange into another sale down the road, is it may complicate their future exchanges or create unintended tax consequences down the road. Because if I exchange out of this property that I've done a cost segregation, my replacement property also needs to have a cost segregation done. And this is something it's official. I can't do it myself. I have to have a professional do it. Okay.
Got it.
And a cost seg is going to maybe run $5,000 to $10,000 to have a professional cost segregation. They're probably going to hit me now because I go to someone's fees, but that's just a range.
No, but there's going to be a study that needs to get done on the property they're acquiring.
Yep. So there's professionals that do that they would engage to do that. So the new property, I also need to have a cost seg done on that to defer the recapture, which, by the way, recapture on that segment is at ordinary income. Okay.
Oh, okay. So got it. Wow.
It's a higher tax rate. So recapture on my structure under the 1250 is at 25%. To give you a difference, right? So it is taxed at a higher percentage as far as the recapture repayment of it. And if I've taken 100% in 1 year and I go and sell my property in 4 years, I'm fully depreciated on 25 or 50% of my property that I just have to repay at ordinary income. Unless I do an exchange into another property that have another cost seg, now that 1245 section needs to be of equal or greater value than the one I just exchanged out of.
Okay, so those things stay the same in terms of having to get the deferral.
Yeah, they can defer it, but the cost seg is a element that has to happen in order to get the deferral. Now, one thing to keep in mind, they don't get to start the depreciation schedule over. They're just delaying they're deferring the recapture. Okay. So if they don't do another cost seg, then they'll be paying that money back.
They'll have the recapture hit even doing okay, got it. So that's the big thing is if you've done a cost seg and you're coming out of that, be aware you're going to need to do that in the property you're acquiring.
Either that or be prepared that you're going to have a tax complication from the recapture on the 1245 section.
Gotcha. Okay.
So just because more people are doing it than before, they just may not be aware that, hey, going forward, I'm either going to recapture that depreciation I took, or I need to do another cost seg.
Got it. Okay. Now, if it gets, something happens and it goes to their heirs, do they still get the stepped up basis on that? Does that offset that, or?
Yeah, I don't think you still get the benefit. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. I'm make sure people are aware of that. I think, like I said, yes, I'll look to get some information out regarding the because we've got a lot of clients that either live in California, own in California, or something. I think, they heard about it, but I don't think a lot of people kind of know what the dates are and how that works. So it may be something for those groups to look at. So thank you for taking the time today to share these insights and we'll be in touch, I'm sure, as things change and what happens. So.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me today, Greg. I'm happy to have the conversation. So thank you so much.
Most definitely. All right, we'll see you again next time on HFO-TV. Thank you.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information.